Danke. Hey everybody, let me just connect here. And then we're off to the races. How are you all doing today? Are you excited for the conference? I hope so, I hope so. My name's Max. I come from, not very far, I come from Vienna, which has been a 6-hour train ride. I actually missed my train. The ÖBB threw me out of my train, which was not very fun. But I made it, and I'm here. And today I want to talk to you a little bit about open source. I've done a bunch of open source, right? I have a bunch of open source projects on GitHub. Some are tiny and some are big. Some are used by millions of people and some are used by literally just me. And I think there's a common misconception in the industry that open source is something that's scary or that's something only excellent engineers do, that only the best do open source. I'm not a good engineer, right? I just want to say that up front. I just publish my code on GitHub, right? You can look at it. It's pretty shitty, honestly. People still use it, but it's pretty shitty. I'm here because I want you to contribute to open source, right? I want to take you that fear. I want to take you from I code to I code and other people use it, my code too. Because I do so much open source, I get asked, at every other conference I go to, but Max, how can I get started contributing to open source? How can I do open source things? How can I get green GitHub squares? And so, hello Google. I would have laughed if that actually triggered somebody. The answer I always give in person is solve your own goddamn problems, right? That's really as simple as it is. Because that's a very short answer, I want to elaborate on it a bit, right? So I put together a quick 4-step guide to open source. The first step is that you solve your problem. As developers, we always have problems, and we're always solving them. A problem doesn't necessarily mean a bug. A problem is anything that you have to solve, which could also be a feature, a business requirement, you need to grow your users, whatever. You solve your problem, right? You do this every single day. Every developer does that. You solve problems all day long. Then there's a second step, which is to generalize the solution. And this is a hard step because not every solution is generalizable, and those that are often take a bit of work to make more general. Then comes step 3. Step 3 is a bunch of question marks. And then step 4, of course, is profit. Because that's how everything works, right? In our case, profit is open source. Now, step 3 here, I put a bunch of question marks there because that's really more like 100 steps, right? You need to sign up to GitHub, you need to authenticate, you need to push up your code, you need to write documentation, you need to yada, 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 yada. There's a bunch of steps there, but those are very well documented, right? Like you can Google how to use Git. You can Google how to push something to GitHub. You can Google how to publish something on a package manager. It's not very interesting. What I want to focus on really is those first 2 steps. How do you solve a problem and then make it more general? How do you get from, hey, I built something, to, hey, I built something and you can use it too? I want to make a point, which is that open sourcing helps you the most. When I open source things, 99% of the time, I don't open source things for other people. I open source things for myself. When I solve a problem and I generalize a solution and then I push it up to GitHub, the next time I have that same problem, I don't have to solve it again. Because I generalized the solution, I can use my pre-existing solution for the same problem. That means when you open source something, the worst case scenario is that you have a solution for the next time you have the same problem, which is a pretty great worst case scenario, honestly. You don't have to do the same work twice. That's pretty great. And then a much more likely scenario is that you have a better solution for next time, because it often happens that people find your projects and start using them, and then they think, oh, this solution is great, but I have this one more requirement, and they improve your solution. So not only, when you open source something, not only do you have a solution for the next time you have a problem, you have a better solution, because it's not just your solution, but your solution, and that guy helped you, and that girl helped you, and that person over there helped you, and suddenly you have a much better solution for the next time you have the same problem. Now that's all well and good, but I want to talk about some examples because it's all very theoretical, right? And I want to show you what I mean. In one of my apps, like a year ago, I had to build support for logging in with GitHub. You've probably used logging in with Twitter or logging in with GitHub before. And I had to support that in my app. I wanted my users to be able to authenticate to my service via a GitHub account. And so I Googled how to do that, and it turns out that for all of these logging in with whatever provider things, there's a common spec called OAuth. And when you Google OAuth, you'll find diagrams such as this one, right? OAuth is very, very complex, and when I saw this, my reaction was, what? How does that work? It's really complex because the backend has to do a bunch of security things, generate state, redirect to GitHub, redirect your user back, get a token, redirect back to you. It's super complex, and it took me a day or two to wrap my head around how it's even supposed to work. And then eventually, after a couple days of coding, I got it to work, right? I got my users to be able to authenticate via GitHub, and that was great. And at that point, I submitted a pull request on GitHub, and most people stop there, right? Or if you don't work with the Git workflow, you just add it to your master branch and that's it. But when I finish something, I always ask myself the magic question: can I make it open source? And there were a bunch of different parts to OAuth, right? Like you have a button on the front end that redirects to your backend, and then on your backend has to get a token from GitHub, and then GitHub sends that token back, and then you use that token to redirect the user to GitHub, and then GitHub redirects the user back to your backend, and then your backend redirects back to your front. It's a whole bunch of steps. And so I thought, how can I package this up and tie it together so that the next time I have to build support, the next time I have to support logging in with GitHub, I don't have to build all of that crap again. And the answer was a tiny microservice, right? I packaged everything up as a tiny, tiny Node.js server, which I pushed to GitHub. It's called micro-GitHub. You can get this code, and you can deploy it in 5 seconds via Sites Now, and then you have support for logging in with GitHub in your own app. If you look at the code in this repository, if you look at the single JavaScript file that's there, it has a solid 67 lines of code. That's a tiny amount of code. You can write 67 lines of code in 5 minutes, probably. But these 67 lines of code took me quite a while to wrap my head around, right? The knowledge that I was required to have to build those 67 lines of code was a pain to acquire. And I didn't want to do it again the next time. So now if I have an app and I want my users to be able to authenticate via GitHub, I just deploy this in 5 seconds, and I've built that feature in 5 minutes. So my important point with this example is that you should always ask yourself the magic question: can I make it open source? Because many things can be open sourced and they can be generalized. It might take a bit of work. It will take a bit of work. You have to package it up. You have to document it. You have to do a bunch more steps. But the more you do it, the more natural all those steps will become. For me, I just do those things, right? I don't even think about it. I write readmes in my sleep because I've done it a million times now, right? It's like a muscle that you train, an open source muscle, so to speak, right? And the more you do it, the more used to you get to doing it. For me, I don't even ask myself this question consciously anymore. I just build things to be open sourced. I don't even ask myself afterwards anymore, right? And it's like a muscle that you have to train. And it really helps to get started with just asking yourself, can I make it open source? And some things, the answer will be no. And that's fine. Not everything can be open sourced. If you add the logo of your company to the navbar, you probably can't really open source that. And that's totally fine, right? Not everything is meant to be open source. But you will notice, if you ask yourself this question, that many things could be open sourced and they could be helpful for others. Or they could also just be helpful for you, for future you in half a year, right? As a second example, I had to do something very common. This is 2 or 3 years ago. I wanted to add social media sharing buttons to my website, right? Back then, social media sharing buttons were all the hype. And so I looked into how to add social media sharing buttons to my website. And the way you add social media sharing buttons to your website is you have these script tags from all of your social medias that you add to your page, and then those hook into your buttons and make them look the Facebook way or the Twitter way or whatever way. And so I added those, and then I looked at my page, and my page got way slower. And I thought, why do a couple of buttons make my page so much slower? That doesn't make any sense. And so I looked into what exactly these sharing button SDKs were loading, right? And so, for example, when you add the Facebook sharing button SDK, you're loading 73.3 kilobytes of JavaScript, and you're doing 3 network requests. On Twitter, it's 52.7 kilobytes of JavaScript and 4 network requests. On LinkedIn, if you add LinkedIn sharing buttons to your website, 47.7 kilobytes of JavaScript and 2 network requests, and so on and so forth. So to render like 5 buttons, I had to add hundreds of kilobytes of JavaScript to my page. How does that make any sense? How does that make any sense? I want 5 buttons on my page, and I have to add hundreds of megabytes of JavaScript. That doesn't make any sense. There's a famous quote by the creator of Erlang, Joey Armstrong, about object-oriented programming, where he said, you wanted a banana, but what you got was a gorilla holding the banana and the entire jungle. He was talking about object-oriented programming, right? But slightly rephrased, this fits very well to sharing buttons. You wanted a button, but what you got was a gorilla holding the button and an entire JavaScript framework. That's really what social media sharing buttons feel like. You get so much crap just to render a button. That doesn't make any sense. So I went ahead and I reverse engineered these social media sharing button SDKs. Now I say reverse engineered under air quotes because what I really did is I just looked at what they do, right? And they output buttons that have a link. And that's literally all there is to it. All of these services have a link like facebook.com/share, and then they have query parameters with some text and the link to your website, and that's all. And I thought, hold on, this is just a link that I can write myself. Like, I can figure out how to write that link. I can figure out the query parameters. I don't need 52.2 kilobytes of JavaScript just to do that, right? And so I dug into all of the different providers that I wanted, and I figured out how their links work, and I figured out which query parameters to pass, and I figured all of that out. And then eventually, I had social media sharing buttons on my website without adding hundreds of kilobytes of JavaScript. And that was great. And then I asked myself the magic question, of course. Can I make it open source? Now, this was a bit more complicated because I could have just open sourced my buttons, but why would you put a button that shares my page to your website? That doesn't make a ton of sense. And so rather than open sourcing the buttons themselves, I built a generator for them. Right? So this generator, you can add your own URL, you can add your own text. You select which social medias you want, how the buttons, there's different styles for buttons, and then you just get a bunch of code, right? You get a bit of HTML, a bit of CSS, you add that to your page, and you're good to go. You're off to the races. And this generator that I built for social media sharing buttons, that I open sourced. That is on GitHub, that code. That was one of the very first React apps I built, so please don't look at the code. It's horrible. But it works, you know? And people use it. And so what I want to tell you with this is that sometimes you can take knowledge and you can package it up nicely too. It's not just code that you can package up and open source, it's also knowledge that can be made into projects and can be packaged up and used in different ways. As a last example, I want to talk about something that happens fairly commonly. I had to implement custom caching behavior in Apollo client. Now that is not very common, don't get me wrong. If you don't know what that means, don't worry. Essentially, Apollo client caches your GraphQL requests locally. And I wanted it to work slightly differently, right? I wanted the library to do something that was outside of what it normally did. And I read the documentation, but the documentation for custom resolvers, which is the feature I had to use to get that done, was super confusing, right? I messed around with it for half a day, and it still didn't work. And then, you know, but I dug through it, and I kept trying new things, and I kept trying other things. And eventually, I got it to work. Eventually, I had my custom caching behavior, and it worked beautifully, exactly as I needed it to. And so I asked myself the magic question, can I help open source? And I did. I rewrote a bunch of the documentation around custom resolvers. Writing good documentation for your own stuff is very, very hard. Especially if it's something big and something complex, because you're so focused in on the code and you know exactly how it works, it's hard to appreciate how it feels like from the outside, how a user would go towards a problem, right? And so writing good documentation is extremely hard. I struggle with it every single day. So one of the best things you can do to get started in open source or to help everybody else is to improve the documentation of existing projects. Because you will struggle with projects, right? There's always things that projects don't do exactly as you need them to, and so you try to work around them, or you try to find that one option that does the thing you need it to. And when you find that, please help improve the documentation of the project, because I can guarantee you that you're not the only one that's running into that problem. You're not the only one struggling with that. And if you improve the documentation, you're the one person that had to struggle with it, but then everybody else doesn't have to struggle with it anymore. And you, in half a year, also won't have to struggle with it anymore, which is very great. So improving documentation is a great first step to get started in open source. And even if you've done open source before, improving documentation is a great second, third, or hundredth, or thousandth contribution, right? Improving documentation is one of the most vital things you could be doing to help the larger group of people that use said open source project. I also want to stress that open source projects aren't that different from your work projects, right? You might be using GitHub, you might be using Git, you might be using Mercurial or whatever, but whatever you're using, open source projects don't work that differently from your work projects. There's no boss, there's nobody forcing you to finish something, but at the same time, there's other people working with you on the same code base. So you use branches, you merge pull requests, you submit issues, you discuss about things, you discuss which features to implement, you discuss how to fix bugs the best way. It's very similar to what you already do. It's just in the open, right? That's literally the only difference, the privacy setting on GitHub. There's also an important note I want to make, which is that you won't go from 0 to Dan Abramov overnight, right? That's just not going to happen. And I don't mean to I don't mean to call out Dan Abramov specifically. He's just a very prolific GitHub contributor. But you won't go from 0 to hero overnight, right? If you look at my GitHub contribution graph, you'll see that I registered on GitHub in 2014. And in 2014, I had 3 very intensive days of open source. 3 very, very intensive days of open source, right? I started off with 3 days. Then in 2015, I did a bit more because I started building sharing buttons.io. I started building, I open sourced that generator. And then around autumn, I slowed down again because I started studying. And then I, in the winter break, it started picking up again. And then in 2016, it exploded. 2016 looks great, right? It's very, very green. I did a bunch of open source stuff in 2016. And now in 2017, I'm still doing a bunch of open source, but not as much as 2016. Still a ton. And so what I'm trying to tell you with this is you're not going to go from a completely gray squares to completely green squares. That doesn't happen. It's going to take time. You have to train your open source muscle, right? It's something you have to build into your workflow. At the same time, don't compare yourself unfairly, right? If we look at my contribution graph, you're thinking, this dude worked 5 days a week, and then every evening he came home and worked for another 8 hours on open source. How does that work? But really, during most of 2016, I was employed to work on open source. Imagine if all of your work projects were open source. Your GitHub graph would look exactly the same, right? Because you work every day, except maybe on weekends. You work every day, right? That's the same thing. So don't compare yourself unfairly to me, because I was employed to do that, right? I was employed to work on open source full time. It's what I did. It was my job. So even if your GitHub graph looks like my 2014 GitHub graph, that's great. You're doing something to help yourself, which is awesome. So to summarize, ask yourself the magic question, can I make it open source? Whenever you solve a problem, ask yourself that one question, and you'll already be much better off. Oops. Knowledge can sometimes be made into open source projects. And I should probably mention this, if knowledge cannot be made into open source projects, then please at least write a blog post about it. Because even if you can't package it up as an NPM module or whatever, if you write a blog post about it, believe me, future you will appreciate it, because you will run into that same problem again, you will Google that problem, and then you'll find a blog post that you've written yourself. That's the most ridiculous feeling ever. That happened to me recently, because I wrote a blog post about the HTML details element a while back. And then I had to use that again, and I was like, hold on, how does that element work? And I Googled it, and of course I find my own blog post. And I'm like, oh, I knew this before. I knew how this worked. And of course, the most important part, please, please improve the documentations of projects you use. That's one of the most vital things you could be doing to help everybody else, right? It helps me, it helps you, it helps everybody else. It's really, really important. That's it. Thank you very much for listening to me.